This is BD World. I am SYED SHABAHAT, and you're watching Fault Lines. Militancy is one of the older problems of this region, particularly Afghanistan, as a country that has remained broadly under control of various bands of militants that not only have caused problems for people of Afghanistan but also have caused concerns for the neighboring countries. ISKP is one of such militant outfits that is today causing a lot of concern not only for Afghan Taliban but also for the neighboring countries. ISKP has been trying to isolate Taliban diplomatically, and in despite of this effort, it has caused some serious damage to the interest of many neighboring nations. For example, Chinese have been attacked inside Kabul, and Russian embassy was also targeted. Pakistan's ambassador was also targeted by ISKP. All of this has been a hallmark of their effort to isolate Afghanistan in the international arena. But is ISKP alone in its effort? Does the organization wish to hold back some territory in near future, or is it only going to play hide and seek with the law enforcement? All of this in today's program. Team Fault Lines have prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
Pakistan is grappling with the challenge of militancy, but entire nation is committed to combat terrorism because peace was gained through the sacrifices of thousands of Pakistani citizens and gallant security forces. There are mounting concerns that Islamic State groups branch in Afghanistan and Pakistan is capable of conducting transnational terror operations. United Nations Security Council in February estimated that ISIS-K had 1,000 and 3,000 fighters and retained ambitions to conduct external operations. IS Khorasan ranks are further swelling as a result of desertions on the ranks of proscribed group Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Meanwhile, Pakistan has seen a rise in terrorist attacks across the country believed to have been planned and directed by TTP leaders based in Afghanistan. The annual Global Terrorism Index released by Australia-based Institute for Economics and Peace said that Pakistan recorded the second largest increase in terrorism-related deaths worldwide in 2022. A National Security Committee meeting agreed to launch an all-out comprehensive operation to rid the country of the menace of terrorism. Pakistan has been calling on the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan to take action against TTP militants and other terror groups operating from Afghan soil. The Afghan Taliban have to ramp up counter-terrorism operations across Afghanistan, and its intelligence agencies have to track TTP and ISIS-K's activities. As per understanding reached in Doha Agreement, Afghanistan's policy should be that there shall be no threats or harms from Afghanistan soil against any country, and no one will be allowed to threaten other countries from Afghanistan soil.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first guest that I have in my program today is Mr. Lucas Weber, who's joining me on Skype from Toronto, Canada. Lucas Weber is co-owner of Militant Wire Network. Mr. Lucas Weber, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Weber, recently ISKP has hinted that it plans to attack somewhere in the West. Perhaps this is something which might have caused a lot of concerns in the United States and the rest of the West, which includes Europe. How do you feel? How serious is this threat?
The United Nations and U.S. Central Command have raised concerns about the Islamic State Khorasan province's intent and possible ability to direct and execute attacks throughout the West and potentially even onto the North American continent. Now, ISKP has stated that they would like to conduct such attacks and have threatened the U.S. and European countries, but their capabilities are fairly limited at the moment. So it is more likely that the group would be able to incite one of its followers to conduct an attack in the West.
But Mr. Weber, don't you think it's merely a publicity stunt because this organization, ISKP, does not have a lot of manpower, even inside Afghanistan? They don't have control on any territory. So is it not merely a publicity stunt?
Well, it is possible that it is both. Since the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan in August of 2021. The group's media and propaganda focus, its propaganda narratives, have expanded from primarily being focused on the local to the broader regional and even international arena. And they have stated that they have threatened attacks against various regional enemies and are now threatening attacks against the West. But their attacks inside Afghanistan even are fairly limited, and inside Pakistan they're even more limited. So it's uncertain if they actually would be able to pull off any kind of attack into Europe or North America.
Mr. Weber, why ISKP is still such a paramount challenge for Afghan Taliban, despite the fact that it does not hold any territory in the country?
Um, the Islamic State Khorasan province does not threaten to topple the Taliban. The Taliban are simply too strong at this point. ISKP's military strategy has shifted from looking to gain territory in the past to a campaign of urban terrorism and guerrilla warfare. So they're conducting hit and runs, assassinations, roadside bombings, things of this nature to harass the Taliban. And while they're not a threat to the Taliban, they're making it a point to undermine the Taliban's foreign relations with countries such as Pakistan, Russia, and China by attacking their nationals, foreign nationals of these countries, on Afghan soil. And we can see this with the Pakistan and Russian embassy attacks, as well as the Kabul hotel attack targeting Chinese nationals. So this brings pressure down on the Taliban, which is disproportionate to ISKP's capabilities, but they're choosing to strike these big and important targets with the limited resources they have.
Mr. Weber, ISIS that was once ruling a landmass spread in two countries is now remained a splinter group or a band of splinter groups operating in different regions. Do you believe this is a part of their strategy, or is it the only option that they are left with after being reduced in size by all the organizations that they have been fighting with?
After the official loss of their last bastion of the caliphate in 2019, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria have reverted to their DNA as a guerrilla insurgency group, and there is no doubt they have been severely degraded by the Western-backed coalition as well as from the Russian side. But they have notably the continent of Africa has become a kind of center of gravity where they have some very powerful branches, one in the Sahel and especially in Nigeria and the Lake Chad region with Islamic State West Africa province. So while they've been weakened in the Middle East, they have managed to expand and establish branches of various capacities across Asia and Africa.
But going forward, do you think they are going to keep the same strategy, or eventually would they want to come back and start holding some more pieces of land and to govern them? Because this is what the word emirates means. It might just be a surprise if they have permanently given up their dreams of having an emirate.
I believe that they are biding their time. They're remaining as a cohesive guerrilla network and movement in the Middle East, and they would no doubt jump on any opportunity that presents itself if there is some form of instability or state failure in the region. Now, they have managed to take large swaths of territory in Africa, and in Afghanistan, the strategy is similar to the one in the Middle East, where they're looking to perpetuate their movement, keep the Taliban on its toes with these constant harassment attacks, and perhaps wait for some kind of rift to open up inside the Taliban to take advantage of and perhaps capture some amount of territory.
Mr. Weber, how seriously the West has taken this challenge? Because as we can see from this part of the world, that the West, and particularly United States, is today more focused on challenges that have been extended by Russia or maybe by China. It doesn't have any energy or any focus left, in our opinion, for such militant outfits. How do you comment on it?
Yes, well, with the end of with the end of unipolarity, the unipolar moment where U.S. was the sole hegemon, we now see a resurgent Russia and a China on the rise. So great power competition has undoubtedly become the number one priority for the United States, and the United States is bogged down in Eastern Europe, and they are now increasingly preparing for the potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So this leaves very little resources for counterterrorism, and the global war on terrorism has been drastically scaled back. So there is a danger of the West taking their eye off the ball and perhaps some kind of significant terrorist attack or multiple slipping through.
So, do you believe ISIS to be a militant organization now, or do you think it to be a band of different organizations loosely integrated together, having different agendas and different leadership?
Well, there is a chain of command which is centered in the Middle East that connects all of these different branches. And the various branches are also connected through propaganda groups, financing networks, recruitment networks, and aspects of this nature. So there is a overlap between various groups. We can see it in South Asia, for instance. We can see that the Central Asian contingent of ISKP has links to IS in Syria and raises money for women and children of ISIS families that are being held in detention camps in Syria. So there are these broad transnational propaganda recruitment and fundraising networks that do connect these groups, even across continents.
Mr. Weber, Russia, as you pointed out, has now lesser control in Syria. It has lesser people, lesser security apparatus to deal with Syria, or the issues related to Syria. ISIS has yet not been able to capitalize on the vacuum created by Russia. What do you believe can be the reason behind?
Well, Russia will continue supporting the Assad government in Syria while it is uh, very bogged down in a war of attrition in Ukraine where there is no end in sight. But it appears that Russia's counterterrorism capacity at home remains fairly strong. And though we can't authenticate these videos, there are posts being made showing the Russian FSB launching fairly regular raids on positions of Islamic State sympathizers, potential returned fighters, and elements that may be connected to official branches. Now, what we have seen actually is the Islamic State in Afghanistan has been exploiting the Ukraine war for its own propaganda purposes, and it's calling upon Muslims who are fighting on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side to abandon their posts and join the Islamic State to go back to Russia and fight the Russian government.
Do you believe Russia and China and the Central Asian republics would also be concerned, like Pakistan, with this spillover effect of ISKP? Or do you believe ISKP, in opinion of the neighbors, is going to only concentrate inside Afghanistan?
I believe there are. For instance, Russian forces are engaging the Islamic State in Syria. Russia's Wagner Group, semi-state organization, is fighting against jihadists in Mali and across the Sahel. And since the Islamic State's formation of the caliphate, in the first speech after it was formed, Russia was declared as the leader of the Crusader East and put on par in terms of priority enemy with the United States. So the Islamic State continues to produce anti-Russian propaganda. It hit the Russian embassy a few months back inside Afghanistan, and now we on the Chinese side we are seeing more and more attention being paid to China by the Islamic State Khorasan province, and they've attacked Chinese nationals at a hotel in Kabul, and they've also they conducted a suicide bombing at the Taliban's foreign ministry while Chinese delegation was reportedly set to meet Taliban representatives. And even after this, they continue to threaten attacks against the Chinese and try to recruit from other Chinese or anti-Chinese jihadist groups such as the Turkestan Islamic Party.
And lastly, Mr. Weber, how the Russia Ukraine conflict has affected ISKP. Has it changed anything about ISKP's strategy or their propaganda strategy or anything that has changed because of Russia Ukraine conflict?
Yes, well, how the Islamic State Kherson province is trying to portray this, they've released videos mentioning it and two very detailed magazine articles about the war. And they're paying increasing focus on what is perhaps the most significant geopolitical event of our times. And what they're trying to do is they're saying that the wars that Russia and even Ukraine, with its limited involvement in Iraq, have been waging against Muslims in past decades. This extreme violence has come home and has come to Europe's doorstep, whereas these powers are mutually destroying themselves. A proxy war between Russia's allies, US's allies is taking place. And meanwhile, the Islamic State Khorasan province is looking at this as divine retribution for what these countries have done to Muslims and their foreign policy in the Islamic world in past decades.
Thank you very much, Lucas Weber, for being our guest in the program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber, for being a guest in our program today.
Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Mr. Lucas Weber, and now I have another prestigious guest in the show. He's joining me from Venice, Italy. His name is Riccardo Welle. He is head of research for Khorasan Diary. Mr. Welle, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, and good evening, everyone.
Mr. Welle, IS has disintegrated from its heartland, that is Middle East, and has started emerging as a more active entity in the heart of Africa. What do you believe can be the reason behind?
Yes, exactly. So looking from a broader perspective, we can see that Africa has become the hotspot of the global jihadist movement. We can see this from the Islamic State perspective, but also from other local and global jihadist, international jihadist organizations like Al-Qaeda. So speaking about the Islamic State, we see that the Islamic State has made Africa a priority for its global strategy of jihadist activities. This is clear when we look at the different provinces that the Islamic State has set up in Africa. We are talking about the Islamic State West Africa province, the Islamic State Greater Sahara province, the Islamic State Sahel province, the Islamic State Central Africa, and the Islamic State Eastern Africa. And we have been monitoring, we have been witnessing a development, an increase of jihadist activities of the Islamic State in this continent, whereas in other parts of where the Islamic State, part of the world where the Islamic State is active, there has been a decrease in Islamic State activities. Let's see the Middle East, let's see the Philippines, also with to a less extent, in this region of the Islamic State, where operates the Islamic State Khorasan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So in Africa, this increase in the Islamic State activities is due to the fact that here in Africa, especially in some crucial areas, uh, between Mali and the Sahel, or the Islamic State West Africa, where the Islamic State West Africa operates in between Nigeria, Niger, and Lake Chad region. These areas are characterized by porous borders where jihadists are freely moving between countries, and thus countries in the region have difficulties in tackling the jihadist phenomenon. So this partially can explain why the Islamic State has been able in Africa to take advantage of the instability and the weaknesses of the weaknesses of the security apparatuses of these countries, in order to gain not only to be able not only to carry out attacks, but also to create footholds and territorial footholds in these countries.
But Mr. Wale, my question was why Africa has become the center of gravity for ISIS, or the groups that associate themselves with ISIS.
This is absolutely true. In fact, we see how the Islamic State, especially again, where it was able to capture territorial footholds, especially in Nigeria, in the northeastern part of Nigeria, huge regions like in the north, they have been where the Islamic State has been capturing entire cities. Here we witness to the population initially welcoming these jihadists, and this is because the state was failing in providing even basic services to the local population. And thus, these groups had been able to capitalize on grievances of the local population to gain initial favor from the locals. However, in the long run, as in other parts of the world where the Islamic State was able to set up its own version, distorted version of government, the local population realized what was the real when it was set up its own administrations, and similarly to other parts of the world, like in Afghanistan or in the Philippines or in the Middle East itself, the local population progressively realized the tyranny that the Islamic State was going to establish in this captured territory. Hence, the Islamic State also lost its local support in Africa, and this is the reason why in between 2017 and 18, Islamic State West Africa mostly lost all of its territorial stronghold in Nigeria.
Let's come back to Afghanistan. How big of a threat ISKP or Daesh would be for Taliban in Afghanistan? Do you think it's a paramount challenge that is going to paralyze their administrative capacity?
So when we look at the Afghan situation, or the situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan, actually, and the Islamic State Khorasan, we have to see the Islamic State Khorasan as the main rival jihadist organization, not only to the Taliban, but also to all jihadist organizations in the region, hence also Al-Qaeda. So this means that the Islamic State Khorasan is trying to delegitimize the Taliban government on the same topics of discussion that the Taliban had been putting forward when they were trying to delegitimize the previous Republican government in Afghanistan. And the Taliban are aware of the fact that ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan narratives, ISKP narratives, are extremely powerful and have the capabilities to lure militants within the Taliban movement and within other jihadist organizations in the region in the folds of the Islamic State Khorasan, in order to ultimately overthrow the Taliban government. Now, when I say overthrow the Taliban government, this is the ultimate goal, of course, of the Islamic State Khorasan. But in the short, medium term, the goal of the Islamic State Khorasan is to actually destabilize Afghanistan, creating rifts in the society, local society, religious and ethnic rifts, in order to capitalize on the grievances of the local population. Hence, preventing the Taliban from completely transition from an insurgent movement to a proper functioning government, which is able to provide also services to the local population.
Mr. Weller, despite all these challenges that Taliban are facing domestically and internationally, they have not been able to capitalize on their largest diplomatic asset, their largest diplomatic support, that is Pakistan, on the issue of TTP, Taliban have not been able to meet expectations that Islamabad had. How rational or justifiable would this act be of Taliban of not keeping up to the expectations of a country that has helped them thus far?
So when we look at the relations between the TTP and the Afghan Taliban, we have to recall to remember that TTP and Afghan Taliban have been fighting the same war for the last 20 years on different regional geographic regions, of course. One was mainly focused on Afghanistan and the other mainly focused in Pakistan. But we have to remember also that the TTP was actually fighting in Afghanistan. So when looking at from this perspective, as well as the tribal and family links between the two organizations, it's actually impossible to sharply divide the two entities from one another. So the approach of the Afghan Taliban to the TTP is an approach which cannot be only based on realpolitik, let's say realpolitik, from a realpolitik approach. It has to be analyzed under the lens of jihadist mentality and religious connections between the two groups. The TTP pledged allegiance to the leader of the Afghan Taliban, so the first leader of the Afghan Taliban, and it renewed its pledge of allegiance all the subsequent leaders. And the Afghan Taliban always accepted this pledge of allegiance. So we could not underestimate the bond that this pledge of allegiance is via between the two organizations. The impact of this pledge of allegiance on the relationship, on the strong relationship which is between these two entities.
Lastly, Baloch militancy has also been a major problem for Pakistan and a point of concern as well. If we look at the number of attacks on the military, the highest numbers have been recorded in Balochistan. Why do you believe these organizations have been standing so strong despite all the efforts made by the state?
So actually, when we look at the Baloch, the overall problem of the Baloch militant insurgency, we have to analyze it as a three-dimensional problem, which is directly linked to the fact that this issue is a regional issue, not only a Pakistan issue. So basically, this would require the cooperation of all different of three countries in the region, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, in order to tackle this issue. So because these groups, these organizations are able to cross the borders between the three countries, hence they, in order to suppress this freedom of movements, it would require an enormous effort and coordination from the three countries interested by this insurgency. And this is also openly admitted by the same Baloch militant organizations when they clearly show that they are freely moving in between these countries. I will give you just an example. Many prominent Baloch Liberation Army commanders were actually neutralized in Afghanistan, in the Haskamina neighbor of Kandahar, and where they're actively hiding from Pakistani authorities, of course. And from these hideouts, they were planning attacks inside of Pakistan. And let's also remind ourselves that remember that Balochistan is witnessing probably one of most attacks monthly compared to other provinces of Pakistan, even more than Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wale, for being guest in our program today.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with second segment of program. Stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Nonetheless, Pakistan is facing one of the most severe economic crises of its financial history. Yet the government is taking decisions that are very difficult to be taken by a political government, particularly when they are in the last phase of their tenure. IMF had set forth requirements that were very hard for Pakistan, but one after another, all these requirements have been met. Lastly, the brotherly countries have also given their financial commitments or hinted to give their financial commitments to IMF, which concludes all the requirements set forth by IMF. And now there is nothing that should stop Pakistan from completing this IMF program that has to be completed by June 2023. While all of this is happening, what is the financial situation or the economic snapshot of the country? What is the situation of balance of payment? How the government have been able to cope up with the challenges? All of this in this second segment of my program, where I have invited Dr. Mahmood Khalid from Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Dr. Mahmood Khalid, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Dr. Khalid, balance of payments is one of the major concerns for any student of economics who's studying developing countries who are under the immense stress of the international debt. How is Pakistan's balance of payment situation today? Can you give us some numbers, please?
Well, it's a really important question to look into because of policies adopted by government of Pakistan. You're very right in saying that we have actually tried to manage the free fall to an extent that now we are in a position where we are trying to sustain minimum levels of our foreign exchange reserves. Now, how has that happened actually? In order to explain that, let me take you through some of the figures which were presented in the State Bank's report, which they prepared on a quarterly basis, and they have basically put up figure up to February, which identifies that our current account balance has actually it is still in negative, but as compared to the last year's figure for the same period, July to February, it has substantially improved. So if you talk in terms of value, in the corresponding period, July to February fiscal year 2022, our current account balance was around negative $12 billion, which has reduced significantly to $3.8 billion, almost three times less. How has that happened? The good thing within that is that our exports have actually not that much falling. So if you look at the figures, our exports have actually come down from value of for the same period, July to February fiscal year 2022, in which it was around $20.6 billion, and it has come down to 18.7. Whereas our imports have substantially reduced. They were close to $48 billion for the same period, and now they have substantially reduced to around $37.4 billion. So that is something which was really helpful in terms of curtailing still it's a negative value for our current account balance, but substantially it has gone down. And another good thing is that our remittances have also not fallen, and that is something which we owe to our expatriates as well, that they are very committed to Pakistan in terms of sending their remittances, and that has kept its pace close to around $2 billion per month, and that has actually helped us to sustain this position so far.
Dr. Sab, in my previous show, when I had invited you maybe 4 weeks ago, you had showed some concerns, some reservations on the ban on imports or the unannounced restriction on imports. You had said that more than 60% of the revenue that is collected domestically comes from the imports. And now, if imports are not regularized or generalized, this is going to cause some further concern for the country. How do you see this import reduction strategy at play by the government?
Well, if you think about imports, uh, these are not something which we can only think about as an item which uh, is for our luxury consumption or something which is not of use in terms of our overall economy. it has major impacts. As you have rightly mentioned that we talked about it in the last program as well, that imports are actually one of the tax bases as well, in which we collect almost 60 to 65% of our taxes, especially the general sales tax, which we collect on the import stage from the product. Since the base is very big, so we had very good, healthy revenue collection from that. So when we say that we have been able to restrain our trade account by cutting down or our imports by some administrative measures, we are also saying that on the other side, we would also be losing the revenue which would be collected from that. So there is a cost attached to this balancing act as well, which sooner or later is going to reflect in terms of our overall revenue collection as well. And as you might have also read in the newspapers as well, that there was a concern that the FPR has not been able to actually work in terms of delivering on the commitments for the targets which they had set on. And one of the major reasons within that was that our imports were significantly reduced, hence they were not able to collect the required customs from that.
So, Dr. Khalid, do you believe a continuation of import restrictions is the only choice that the government have at this very moment?
Well, actually, the government is looking for certain alternatives in which these restrictions could be eased in a sense that some breathing space could be provided to the overall economy. Because remember, as I mentioned earlier, the imports are not just for luxury consumption. They also have certain capital or the machinery which is required for setting up new plants, and it also has some raw material which is required for our industrial setups. So we cannot have an embargo for a longer period. There has to be some solution. And the government is actually looking forward in terms of alternatives, such as looking for some kind of a currency swap agreements. They're also working in terms of having a trade which is not in US dollars, rather it is on the country to country basis currency, so that the requirements for having a foreign exchange reserves in terms of dollars is minimized. And on top of that, they're trying to work out some solution in terms of generating additional resources, at least for the time being. Because remember, something in terms of the problem which is chronic in nature would not have a solution which can be provided overnight. Our problems in terms of having trade gaps needs to be improved over the long run in terms of looking for new markets, improving our productivity and other issues. So what the government is trying to do is initially get hold of the situation to an extent that we do not lose our basic parameters. As you have rightly mentioned, that we have been able to manage a significant amount of reserves, but that is still not enough. So we are trying to say cover for around 1 month of our import bill. So in case of an emergency, we would be able to repay. But still the situation is not out of hot waters, and the government is trying to work out how we can somehow improve in the short term some inflows from our creditors, bilateral and multilateral, and over the long run try to improve the situation by fixing the structural issues in terms of our production capacities.
But Dr. Mahmood Khalid, the exchange rate that has been put in a free fall or has been left to the mercy of the market as one of the requirements of IMF, doesn't it in itself serve as a barrier for imports? Do the government actually require any further barriers while the exchange rate is in a free float?
Well, this has been a dilemma in case of our macro policy making, that unlike the other countries where exchange rate adjustments actually help in terms of improving the trade balance by improving the exports and reducing the import bill. But in our case, unfortunately, our exports are not very much sensitive to the exchange rates, because they are not of that nature or of that much value added which can actually generate its demand just based on the price differences. They are of that nature that it needs a long-term approach in terms of increasing their orders and other things. On the other side, our imports, as I've earlier mentioned as well, it's not purely just based on consumption. It has major part in terms of, let's say, energy demands which we have to meet from the rest of the world. Even on the consumption side, the edible oil which we are purchasing from Malaysia and other sources. So these sort of demands are actually not very much reflective of the changes in the exchange rate, and these would still be done. So unfortunately, our exchange rate adjustments have not helped that much in the past, and we really don't see that if further adjustments take place, it is going to help improve our trade balance. For that, we have to think about some other solutions which pertains to technology, research and development, and innovation, which can help in terms of moving up the ladder of our trade balances.
Dr. Shah, IMF's conditions have been met entirely. Do we expect IMF now to complete this program as committed with the country?
Well, it should be, because if you look at the demands which they have required from the government to fulfill as a precondition towards the next tranche, these have all been met, whether it was related to the energy tariff pass on, whether it was related to the free exchange rate adjustment, or whether it was related to having a fiscal consolidation. These were all met. So, theoretically speaking, all the preconditions have been met. Now, what is actually keeping them in terms of having a concrete agreement in terms of moving forward, I think, was related to the commitments which they were asking from the government basically to look for from the rest of the world. Because as everybody knows, that IMF itself is not going to bridge that gap. Rather, the IMF engagement is a kind of a notional engagement, which is going to help the other countries feel that Pakistan is on the right track, and it is going to improve its balance of payment position in future. So they are comfortable in terms of investing in our country. They're comfortable in terms of extending whatever credits they have provided to us, or they, in other sense, are doing business in normal. So what they were looking forward was that Pakistan could get such commitments from the rest of the countries and other institutions as well, so that in future the things are looking good. And I think that these commitments and other adjustments are coming through. So hopefully these things would be inked soon.
Dr. Shah, don't you think that the financial markets are also one of the problems that Pakistan is facing, where due to consistent negative rating, uh, perhaps we have not been able to raise as much capital as we wanted? Don't you believe it is one of the major hindrances that Pakistan is facing at the moment?
Well, actually, yes. As I've just mentioned, that engagement with the IMF is actually not related purely in terms of the value which is going to be transferred from them. Rather, it gives a signal to the market that now the things are in a better position because of the conditionalities being met, the structural problems being identified and worked through. But since the situation has not come out of that hot water situation right now, so we are still in a phase where the international credit market looks at Pakistan as a risky country in terms of offering their credits. So what we are hopeful that if commitments from our brotherly countries and our partners in terms of development, they come through, then the things are going to improve in future for us to borrow from international capital markets as well. But as you know, that since the overall world is facing a kind of a recessionary phase, even today the IMF's World Economic Outlook has come out with the figure that the global growth is not going to be more than 3%, which is quite low as compared to the projections which were made earlier. So what happens is that when the overall, and we know that there is a commodity cycle and the inflations are also high. So in terms of a relative ranking, the position of Pakistan is also identified as to be a more riskier country, because since the cost of capital around the globe has become very high, so Pakistan is actually in a relative sense more expensive in terms of risk taking, which has led the country's rating to be downgraded up to a level which is making our borrowing more expensive.
Lastly, Dr. Mahmood Khalid, do you believe Pakistan's financial worries will continue in the next financial year? Or more specifically, I would want to understand, will Pakistan require to enroll in another IMF program?
Well, as analyst, we believe that Pakistan is going to require another program after this program because the issues have not been resolved in a sense that we can say that the things are going to start improving from onwards. As I said earlier, that the commitments from the IMF are not related to only the tranche which is going to come from them. Rather, it gives a signal to the market that things are improving. So I would suggest that there is no harm in terms of going into another program till the time that it gives signal to the market that the things are improving, and it also helps us to improve certain things which otherwise maybe because of political reasons and others we have actually not been able to look into. So kind of a pressure in terms of improvement of our own structural weaknesses helps at times as well. There is no harm in terms of going into that. When we talk about the next fiscal year, it is going to be tough because, as I've already mentioned, that Pakistan was already in a consolidation phase in terms of the fiscal balances. But the increase in the monetary policy discount rate to combat the inflation has really put a burden in terms of servicing our domestic debts as well. The cost of servicing debt has increased by around 80% as compared to the fiscal year 2022 or the budget estimates which were made at that time because of the increase in the discount rate. So what we are expecting in the next fiscal year, both because of the slowdown in terms of the economic growth, which the World Bank has just projected to be just zero point 0.4, although the government's figure are about it's close to 2.5, but the other parties are actually projecting it to be much lower. Along with that, import compression and the increased cost of services, the debt servicing, these three factors are going to really make the fiscal side very difficult to manage. And I would strongly recommend that this is a time where the government really needs to think through when they're going to make their budget strategy paper, that they have to look for additional resources. It should not just be the federal government which should be taken into account. The provincial governments also needs to chip in terms of doing their part for creating more revenue sources as well as cutting down on the expenditures. But it is going to be tough for the government for the next fiscal year.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmood Khalid, for being guest in our program today.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Dr. Mahmood Khalid from PIDE, and as he was saying, Pakistan's balance of payment situation is not as bleak as painted by many of the media outlets. It's very important, however, that the government of Pakistan keeps following the path set forth by IMF and takes this opportunity to revive the economy on the grounds that can prove to give us sustainable results. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.